June 8, 1969, El Salvador. An 18-year-old girl named Amelia Bolaños is sitting in front of a television set, watching a football match. El Salvador versus Honduras, a World Cup qualifier, the biggest match either country has ever played. In the final minute, Honduras scores. They win, 1-0. Amelia gets up from the sofa. She walks to her father's desk. She opens a drawer, pulls out a pistol, and shoots herself in the heart. 5 weeks later, El Salvador will invade Honduras with tanks, jet fighters, and 12,000 soldiers. Thousands of people will die, all because of a football match. Well, sort of. The real story goes much, much deeper. Let me be clear about something before we go any further. The football war was not caused by football. I know that sounds strange given that we're about to spend the next 10 minutes talking about exactly that, but this is important. The football war, also called the soccer war or the 100-hour war, was a 4-day military conflict between El Salvador and Honduras in July 1969. The football matches were the spark. The fuel had been building for decades. Here's the situation. El Salvador is one of the smallest and most densely populated countries in Central America. Honduras, right next to it, is much larger and much less crowded. For decades, since the early 20th century, Salvadoran peasants had been crossing the border and settling in Honduras, looking for land, looking for work, looking for space. By 1969, there were roughly 300,000 Salvadorans living inside Honduras. Honduras had started to resent it. The government began seizing land from Salvadoran settlers and handing it to Honduran nationals. Thousands of Salvadorans were being pushed out of homes they had built over generations. Both governments needed someone to blame. Both populations were angry. Then came the football. June 8, 1969. Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras. El Salvador and Honduras are playing the first leg of their World Cup qualifier. What happened the night before the match is the part that history books usually skip. A crowd of Honduran supporters surrounded the Salvadoran team's hotel, all night, throwing stones at the windows, leaning on car horns, banging pots and metal barrels, screaming, setting off fireworks. The Salvadoran players did not sleep, not for 1 hour. The next day, exhausted and rattled, El Salvador played badly. Honduras won 1-0, a last-minute goal. That is when Amelia Bolaños shot herself. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary political decisions in football history. The El Salvador government broadcast her funeral on national television. The president walked behind her coffin. His ministers walked behind her coffin. The entire Salvadoran national football team, still in their travel clothes just back from Honduras, marched in the procession. A newspaper called El Nacional wrote that the girl could not bear to see her fatherland brought to its knees. She was 18 years old, and she had just become the first casualty of a war that hadn't started yet. The second match. June 15, 1969, San Salvador, El Salvador's home ground. Now it was El Salvador's turn to set the atmosphere. The Honduran team arrived at their hotel to find the same welcome they had given the Salvadorans. Noise, crowds, zero sleep. But El Salvador went further. Instead of the Honduran national anthem, the stadium speakers played a different piece of music. Instead of the Honduran flag, they raised a dirty rag. The Honduran players stood on the pitch for their anthem and watched a torn piece of cloth go up the flagpole. El Salvador won 3-0. In the stands and on the streets outside, the violence was serious. Honduran fans were attacked. The Honduran team needed a military escort to get out of San Salvador safely. Back in Honduras, Salvadoran immigrants, people who had lived there for years, sometimes decades, began to be attacked. Houses burned, families forced to flee. Both governments were now feeding the fire. Both presses were running stories about atrocities committed by the other side. Most of them were exaggerated. Some were fabricated entirely. It didn't matter. The populations believed them. FIFA, aware that things had gone far beyond football, moved the decisive third match to a neutral country, Mexico City. June 26, 1969. El Salvador won 3-2 after extra time. They qualified for the 1970 World Cup in Mexico. On the same day the final whistle blew in Mexico City, Honduras announced it was cutting all diplomatic ties with El Salvador. Not reducing ties, cutting them, completely. Across Honduras, the violence against Salvadoran immigrants intensified. In the weeks that followed, somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 Salvadorans fled Honduras, many of them families that had lived there for a generation, abandoning everything they owned. In El Salvador, The government announced that Hondurans were committing genocide against their people. The press on both sides called for action. The militaries on both sides began moving toward the border. July 14, 1969. 6 in the evening. The Salvadoran Air Force launched surprise attacks on targets inside Honduras, including Toncontín International Airport in Tegucigalpa, already notorious at the time as one of the world's most terrifying airports to land at, now also being bombed. El Salvador's ground forces followed. 12,000 soldiers crossed the border. Honduras responded. Their own air force was scrambled. What followed was, according to military historians, the last aerial dogfight between World War II-era piston-engine fighter planes ever recorded in combat. Both countries were flying aircraft from the 1940s, Corsairs, Mustangs, against each other in 1969. The jet age had arrived everywhere else. In the skies above Central America, the Second World War was briefly happening again. The fighting lasted 100 hours, 4 days. The Organization of American States intervened. A ceasefire was established. El Salvador eventually withdrew its forces. The official death toll was somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people. Some estimates go higher. Around 300,000 Salvadorans were displaced. The economic damage set both countries back by years. A formal peace treaty between El Salvador and Honduras was not signed until 1980, 11 years after the war ended. El Salvador qualified for the 1970 World Cup, the tournament they had gone to war over, the one Emilia Bolaños had died believing in. They lost all 3 group stage matches. They were eliminated without scoring a single goal. The worst was a 4-0 defeat against the Soviet Union. The country that had launched an invasion over a football qualifier was knocked out of the tournament in the first round. The war itself, the actual military conflict that killed thousands of people, was not caused by football. The land disputes, the migration crisis, the political pressure on both governments, those were the real causes. The football matches were the match that lit the fuse on a barrel that had been filling for 50 years. And that is what makes this story so uniquely disturbing. Because football didn't start a war. Football just made it impossible to pretend the war wasn't already coming. When I first read about Emilia Bolaños, the 18-year-old girl who shot herself because her country lost a football match, I didn't know how to feel about it. Because the story is tragic, and it's real. And what happened to her was used by a government to push an entire country toward war. I've read this story 5 or 6 times now, and every time I get to the part about her funeral, the president walking behind her coffin, the football team marching beside him, I stop. Because football does something to people that almost nothing else does, and sometimes that is beautiful, and sometimes it is this. The World Cup is happening right now, or maybe it already ended. Maybe you're watching this months later and you already know who won. Either way, football is still going. Somewhere, 2 teams are playing that both desperately need to win. Drop the 2026 winner in the comments. Just the country. 1 word. Let's see who was watching this before the final, and who came back after. Subscribe, because the strangest stories in football aren't on the highlights reel. They're buried in history, and most people have never heard them.